The Legends of King Arthur. The Quest for the Holy Grail. Illustrated by Mike Phillips. Chapter 1. King Arthur led the hunting party back through the forest to Camelot. Suddenly, a flash of bright light caught his eye. "Did you see that?" he asked, drawing his horse to a stop. "See what, Your Majesty?" Lancelot asked. There was a flash of light by the river. Lancelot and Gawain hadn't seen anything, but they followed Arthur's gaze. "This way," Arthur announced, as he dismounted and walked to a path through the trees. Quietly telling their squires to stay behind with the horses, Lancelot and Gawain followed Arthur down to the riverbank. There they found an extraordinary sight. Ahead of them was a slab of stone that appeared to have traveled down the river. There was a sword deeply embedded in it. The sword's golden pommel reflected the sun's rays and must have been what had caught the king's eye. "It is just like before," Arthur murmured, approaching the weapon. Lancelot and Gawain glanced at each other. They had heard the story of how Arthur had drawn the sword from the stone when he had been just a boy. "Look, there's an inscription," Arthur called back excitedly. "Many knights will try, but only the best will draw me free," Arthur read aloud. "Surely this sword is meant for you, Lancelot." "I know of no better knight." Lancelot shook his head, taking a step back. "No, Your Majesty. I am not the one meant for this sword," he insisted. He was thinking of his traitorous love for Queen Guinevere. Arthur frowned. "But you are the bravest knight in Camelot?" "Your Majesty, I may be brave but I am not the best." Arthur seemed disappointed but said no more. Instead, he turned to Gawain. "If Lancelot will not take it, then you must try," he said. Gawain looked uncertain for a moment. Then he stepped forwards, gripped the hilt with both hands, and pulled. The sword would not move. Gawain let go. "It seems I am not destined for this weapon either, Your Majesty," Arthur frowned. As they returned to their horses, he couldn't help wondering who could be worthier than his two most trusted knights. "Upon this day, this seat will be filled." Arthur and his knights stared at the round table in shock. The words had appeared in its wooden surface whilst they had been out. No one could quite believe that after so many years, the perilous seat would finally be filled. Sir Owain gazed around at his comrades, voicing the question on everyone's mind, "So, who's this knight we have waited so long for?" "Your Majesty, he has arrived," Merlin announced, before Arthur could reply. Arthur led his knights into the great hall. An old man and a young one of about 18 summers were presented to him. The young man wore plain armor and had a helmet tucked under his arm, but he carried no sword or shield. "Your Majesty," a guard announced. "Nations of Corbenic and Master Galahad beg an audience with you?" Arthur's eyes never left the young man's face. He seemed familiar somehow. Yet Arthur knew that he had never met the youth before. "Welcome to Camelot," he said, as the young man bowed respectfully. Nations said to Arthur, "This is Galahad. He was given to me to raise in the ways of God by his grandfather, King Pelles. He is the son of Elaine of Corbenic and Sir Lancelot du Lac," he added, his eyes landing on Lancelot. "I thought I saw a resemblance," Arthur murmured as Lancelot stepped towards the young man. "My son?" Lancelot asked in disbelief. He recalled the one night he had spent with Elaine when he had thought that she was Guinevere. "How is your mother?" "She died, sir, when I was 10 summers old," Galahad replied quietly. Lancelot felt a pang of sadness. "I am sorry." "Since then I have lived with nations in an abbey not far from Corbenic," Galahad continued. Looking around, Nations' eyes had found the room that held the round table. "Come, Galahad," he said. Ignoring the surprised looks of Arthur and his knights, the old man walked towards the open door. Galahad dutifully followed. It wasn't long before everyone stood at the round table. "It is as I said," Nations announced. Arthur had come to stand beside him, staring down at the table in surprise. The word so recently etched into its surface had changed. Now it read, Galahad. Chapter 2. "But I am not a knight," Galahad said. "That will soon change," Arthur declared, drawing Excalibur. "Kneel, Galahad." Before kneeling, Galahad glanced at Nations, who nodded encouragingly. Placing Excalibur on Galahad's right shoulder, Arthur spoke the vow pledged by every knight. Galahad repeated the words, and then it was done. He was a knight. "Arise, Sir Galahad." Slowly, Galahad rose. "Thank you," he said to Nations. "You have done your sacred duty by me. In time, we shall meet again." Taking Galahad's hand, Nations kissed it and left. "Now, Galahad, take your place at the table alongside your fellow knights," Arthur said as he and the rest of the knights found their seats. Galahad did as instructed, slowly walking towards the empty seat. As he took his place between Lancelot and Percival, a fierce wind sprang up from nowhere. It blew through the room, causing torches in their sconces on the walls to flicker. "What's happening?" Owain demanded, his eyes darting around the chamber fearfully. "Your Majesty, look!" King Bagdemagus cried, pointing to a tiny, shimmering light hovering above the table. Arthur stared in disbelief as the light began to expand, becoming brighter and brighter, shifting and changing shape. Finally, he found himself staring at the image of a golden cup. "The Holy Grail," Merlin murmured in wonder. Just as suddenly as the light had appeared, the image vanished. "God has spoken to us," Galahad said, making the sign of the cross over his chest. "I saw the Grail whilst I was at Corbenic," Lancelot said. "King Pels told me that it would appear in Camelot. He said that when it did, every knight would ride out to prove himself worthy of it. Then let us be tested by God." Sir Bors declared excitedly. "I swear on my honor that come morning, I will begin my quest for this most sacred of objects." One by one, the other knights echoed Bors's intention. None were louder than Percival, who was always eager for adventure. Before long, most of them had left to make preparations for their journeys. Only Arthur, Lancelot, Galahad and Merlin remained. "Galahad," Arthur observed, "I see you do not carry a sword?" Galahad shook his head. "I was raised in an abbey, Your Majesty. I had no need for a sword. God will provide one if it is needed." Arthur smiled, but it was directed at Lancelot. "I believe he already has." Galahad frowned. "What do you mean?" "Come," Arthur said, rising from his seat. "We have something to show you." It didn't take long to reach the river. After tethering their horses to nearby trees, Arthur and Lancelot led Galahad to the sword. In the fading light, the golden pommel no longer shone, but the blade did. As they approached, Arthur realized that the strange glow was coming from inside the sword. Galahad stepped onto the rock and looked back at his king. "Your Majesty, you were right to bring me here. This sword has indeed been sent by God." Reaching out, Galahad took hold of the hilt and pulled. The blade sang as it easily slipped free. "Now all you need is a shield," Arthur said. "You are welcome to take any of those at Camelot." "I think